Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Robert Daly. I direct the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Wilson Center, and we're delighted to be partnering with the Kennan Institute, directed by my colleague Matthew Rojansky, on this and on a series of talks on China and Russia. Welcome to this morning's session. I'd like to begin with Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., not Jr., the Supreme Court Justice that you're probably familiar with, but his father, who in his day was as famous as his son. Wendell Holmes Sr. was a physician, a poet, a professor, a lecturer, and an author, a member of the Fireside Poets in Boston, and he was best known in his day and remembered, insofar as he's remembered now, as the author of a book called The Autocrat of the Breakfast Table, 1858, which I recommend to you if you don't know it. It's a great bedside table book, and he's sort of a proto-psychologist, semi-philosopher, writer of jokes and epigrams, but an interesting guy. And one of his most famous theories, he said that in any interaction between two actors, at least 6 persons are involved. Each actor's true self, which is known only to the divinity, each actor's self-perception, and each actor's perception of the other. So these are the 6 persons involved in an interaction between two actors. So if we're looking at U.S. China-Russia relations, we are dealing, in Wendell Holmes Sr.'s formulation, with relations between 9 different persons, in fact. So that's fairly complicated, and if in fact we look not only at the 9 persons, but at every combination of interactions between 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, and 2, we're dealing with 502 possible different relationships. At the Wilson Center, we want to simplify the complex, so today we're only going to deal with 2 actors' perceptions of a third, Chinese and Russian perceptions of the United States throughout history, in order to try to get a sense of the way that the past narratives about the United States of these 2 great powers influence their views of the United States today. And this is the third in a series that we co-sponsor, the Kennan Institute and the Kissinger Institute, called China and Russia on Their Own Terms, which is an effort to come at relations with the 2 great powers, not primarily from the point of view of United States interests or desires, but to understand them as they see themselves and each other and us. So welcome to the third in this series. Matt is going to introduce one of the speakers. I will introduce the second, and then we will open this up for a general discussion. Matt.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. Thank you to all of you for joining us and to the speakers. And I just want to underscore how great it is to be working with Robert and the Kissinger Institute, the very capable team here, to do this, not least because I think that this is the first chance we've had to do a public event since the 2 of us were together in China. Is that right?
That's right. Yep.
And that was the first part of what I hope will be matched by Robert joining me in Russia shortly. So we're not just doing a sort of talking shop exercise here in D.C. We are attempting to sort of go into the field and really, on behalf of our programs, get a feel for what's going on in both places and how both look at each other. We were, for example, in Harbin, where we talked a lot with with Chinese who have an up-close front seat to the Russia-China relationship. So there'll be a lot more coming from this program, and I'm really thrilled that we're able to do this. Let me introduce our Kennan Institute alum, Professor Sergei Zhuk. He's an associate professor of history at Ball State University. He has taught U.S. history in Russia and in Ukraine for many years. He's published 3 books in Russian and more than 20 articles on colonial American history in English, French, and Russian. I'm always amazed when I go to Russia and I talk to people who have been longtime America watchers, how much more they know about American history than I do. It's sort of embarrassing, but then that's always true of literature, culture, music, and everything else. The Russian education system is really quite amazing. But I won't steal Dr. Zhuk's thunder. Only note that he's published 3 scholarly books in English, Russia's Lost Reformation, Peasants, Millennialism, and Radical Sects in Southern Russia and Ukraine, 1830 to 1917, Popular Culture, Identity and Soviet Youth in Dnipropetrovsk, 1959 to 1984, a somewhat relevant period for the origins of many important individuals in Ukraine these days. And Rock and Roll in the Rocket City, which probably goes down as one of the top 5 titles ever produced by a Kennan alum. I don't know that you're ever going to be able to top that. The West, Identity and Ideology in Soviet Dnipropetrovsk, 1960 to 1985. He's also working on 2 new projects, Symbolic Landscape of Modernity in Russia and Ukraine, about cultural politics, school textbooks, media, tourism, and identity from the 1960s to the present, and People's Diplomacy, the Insider Story of Soviet and Post-Soviet Studies of U.S. History, or the Unofficial History of Russia-U.S. Relations, which is a good introduction to the topic for this morning. Sir.
Yeah, I will try to present just general directions of how Russians perceived America and U.S. history. I will start my favorite figure, Maxim Kovalevsky, a pioneer of American studies in Imperial Russia, visited the United States for the first time in 1882. Kovalevsky was born into the Ukrainian noble family near Kharkiv, studied history, law, and sociology at the University of Kharkiv and Moscow University, where he eventually taught at the Department of Law. Kovalevsky was so fascinated with the American legal and educational systems that he not only tried to publicize his impressions after his American visit in Russia, but also tried to reform these systems in the Russian Empire according to American models. In his memoirs and studies, Kovalevsky especially noted the very important difference between the Russian imperial educational system and American college education. According to Kovalevsky, all academic studies in the United States were free from the state interference, while in Russia the entire scholarship, including the studies of foreign countries like the United States, became the state business, controlled, or he even used the word policed, by imperial bureaucrats. Since Peter the Great's reforms, which had opened the era of modernization in Russia, the sciences and humanities have been state business. The central government sanctioned and encouraged the development of sciences in the Russian Empire. That the Russian Tsar Peter established the Russian Academy of Sciences in 1725. Under the aegis of this academy, the first Russian university was founded in Moscow in 1755. Such centralization of and state influence on scientific activities have especially affected history, which was called upon to exalt the person of the Tsar, to bring up the young generations as Russian patriots, the Tsar's faithful servants, and to ground imperial politics on historical facts. The historian became a servant of the state, and history a component, an integral part of the Russian official ideology. This trend was especially cultivated during the rule of Nikolai I, and it survived all the Russian revolutions, the period of Soviet socialism, and became prominent recently during the Putin's rule. The state-centered trend affected the development of the historical perception of the United States in Russia as well. After the defeat of Russian nobleman revolutionaries' revolt, the so-called Decembrist uprising in 1825-26, a publication of Pyotr Chadaev, the first philosophical letter in Telescope magazine in 1836, Russian intellectuals were divided on the merits of Russian and Western European, including American, history. Chadaev was the first Russian intellectual who criticized in public the historical development of his own country as an Orthodox Christian Slavic power. He set Russia against the progressive, dynamic West as a conservative, backward regime. One group of Russian intellectuals consisted of the Chadaev's adherents who regard Western Europe and America as a model of historical progress for Russia. The other group, Chadaev's opponents, idealized Russia's historical past as a Slavic state and argued for the uniqueness and exclusiveness of the Orthodox Christian road for the Eastern Slavic nations. The first group was called the Westernizers, the second, the Slavophiles. The Westernizers used the history of Western Christian civilization to theoretically ground their intellectual opposition to the Tsarist regime. Eventually, these two intellectual developments influenced the academic studies of foreign countries in Imperial Russia. Overall, during the 18th, 19th centuries, two main traditions had been shaped in Russian historiography. One tradition was the state business of history, the historian's service for the Russian state. The second tradition was the utilization of the experience of West, including American history, to explain future Russian development. The practice of such utilization was divided along the traditional lines into Westernizers and Slavophiles approaches. These two traditions survived both the Russian Revolution and the creation of the Soviet Union. Under the Soviet regime, state control of the history increasingly strengthened. The history of the Western capitalist countries had to ground a theoretically inevitable destruction of capitalism as a social and economic formation and forthcoming victory of communism, a replacement of capitalist modernity with socialist modernity. From such a point of view, the history of the United States of America has been regarded as the history of the leading capitalist power, the main political enemy of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party demanded that Soviet historians find among the facts of American history only a confirmation of the truth of Marxism-Leninism and criticized any concept that contradicted this theory. At the same time, because both systems, American and Soviet, represent two phases of the same industrial modernity, Soviet ideologists required from the Soviet scholars to study especially those elements of that modernity which could be incorporated for improvement of real socialism by rejecting the negative features of capitalist modernity. Paradoxically, those intellectual traditions were influenced by various forms of culture consumption, especially by consumption of American popular culture. Since the publication of adventure novels by James Fenimore Cooper in 1829 in Imperial Russia, a genre of American Western, through various media, from books to movies, shaped Russian and Soviet imagination. This consumption of attractive products of American popular culture led eventually to the cultural fixation of the Russian and Soviet consumers on those products and to their gradual westernization and Americanization. Professional studies, though, of the United States and the Soviet Union, with a few exceptions, appeared only during the Cold War. Both contemporaries and scholars noted that the Cold War confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union led to the intense ideological offensive when thousands of historians and social scientists in both countries became involved in the special fields of area studies, such as Soviet studies in the United States and American studies in the USSR. But in contrast to the American side of the Cold War story, where the US government and various corporations had funded the college-based centers of Soviet studies as early as 1940s, the Soviet centers of American studies were organized much later and only in the Moscow-based and Kiev-based institutions of the Soviet Academy of Sciences. From the very beginning, in the United States, various Russian and Soviet research centers were spread all over the country in a decentralized fashion and were affiliated with different colleges and universities. All these American centers were professionally organized, well funded, and immediately became integrated in so-called academic national security complex, especially during the late 40s and the 50s. Paradoxically, the first professional Soviet centers of American studies appeared much later, only after Stalin's death, during a relaxation of international tensions and an improvement of US-Soviet relations. Institutionalization of American studies, according to the directives of Soviet state and the KGB, began in special research institutes of Soviet Academy of Sciences only in the 60s and the 70s. Although in 1953, the Soviet government tried to create the first special center for the studies of American countries at the Institute of History of Soviet Academy of Sciences. From the very beginning, the center united experts in Latin American and US history. After the division of the Institute of History in 1968 into two separate institutes, of world history and the USSR history, the Center for Studies of American Countries was also divided. All specialists in Latin American history left the center. After this division in 1968, the center was transformed into the new sector of history of the USA and Canada at the new Institute of World History under leadership of a former KGB intelligence officer, Grigory Sevastyanov, with 20 researchers and support staff. Sevastyanov was finally replaced in 1988 by Nikolai Bolkhovina, who was not connected to the KGB. This became the normal institutional practice in all centers for American studies in the Soviet Union until 1991. All leaders of these centers were approved by the KGB or had direct connections to this organization. In 1991, there were more than 1,000 Soviet Americanists, Soviet experts in US politics, economy, and culture, with more than 300 specialists in US history. According to Nikolai Bolkhovitinov, I quote, the main obstacle to the work of Soviet Americanists in the field of American history, as in other fields of social sciences up to the second half of 1980s, were rigid ideological restrictions and the dogmatic treatment of Marxism. Speaking frankly, 90% of Soviet Americanists, as of Soviet historians in general, were simply priests of the Marxist parish. Dogmatic Marxism, with its rigid class analysis, had enormous negative influence on historical studies in our country, but probably the greatest damage was the result of political propaganda, wrote Bolkhovitinov. The scope of anti-American propaganda may be realized after even a passing glance at bibliography of Soviet works on the United States history published from 1945 till the 80s. This bibliography contains almost 4,000 items, from the titles like brutal, American beast, brutality and atrocities of American imperialism. You can realize that all these were very tendentious. Works by Soviet scholars tended to accuse the United States of nearly all the mortal sins and portrayed America as a persistent enemy. The image of an external enemy was necessary to create in the Soviet Union the atmosphere of tension, to justify the authoritarian state, the shortage of food products and housing, the arms race, administrative mismanagement, and poverty in general. It must be said with regret that Soviet historians have made their own contribution in confrontational relations with the United States, unquote. Eventually, the changes in geopolitical situation of the Cold War and opening the Soviet society to outside influences after Stalin involved the intense westernization of both Soviet political and popular culture. So despite the confrontational anti-American character of Soviet academic discourse, the beginning of cultural dialogue with the West strengthened a position of Soviet westernizers, such as Bolkhovinov, for example, in Soviet historiography. Approximately 3 different generations of Soviet Americanists grew up after Stalin. These generations were shaped by 4 different geopolitical phenomena. The first generation of the Soviet experts in American studies created the first schools of Soviet students who became interested in the studies of North American countries rather than of traditionally popular among Soviet scholars, Western European countries. These scholars, like Georgy Arbatov and Nikolai Bolkhovitinov, contributed to founding and developing the first official centers for studies of the United States in Moscow. According to their memoirs and observations of contemporaries, the most important influence for their choice of studying the United States came from World War II, and awareness of the important role of the United States as the main ally of the Soviet Union. In his memoirs, Nikolai Bolkhovinov always emphasized the role of the Second World War in triggering the interest in U.S. history among his generation, the Soviet intellectuals. As he wrote in 1992, I quote, "The British Americanist H.C. Allen once remarked, Hitler made Americanists of us all." I fully agree with this observation. World War II produced an enormous influence in Russia and aroused deep interest in the United States and its history, unquote. For many intellectuals, not only for those who fought in the war, but also for those who just grew up during this war, during the 40s, the United States symbolized a great friendship of 2 great nations and their victory over fascism and international reaction. Unfortunately, the depths of understanding of the United States among the first post-war generation Soviet Americans remained very shallow. A majority of these first professional Soviet Americanists were burdened by the Marxist belief system, image structures, and categories of analysis. They suffered from a great deal of cognitive dissonance and simply looked for evidence to confirm their preconceived images of how the United States functioned. The second geopolitical influence came from the Khrushchev thaw and the first official attempt to open the Soviet Union to the West and begin the first round of relaxation with international tensions with the United States after 1956. The Youth International Festival in Moscow in 1957. The academic exchanges between Soviet and American scholars in 1858. The reorganization of international tourism. Creation of the international travel agencies in the USSR opened the new cultural and ideological horizons for a new generation of Soviet intellectuals known as Шестидесятники, people of the 60s. Future ideological architects of perestroika, such as Alexander Yakovlev, visited and studied in the United States, in Columbia, by the way. The founding fathers of Soviet American study, the first post-war generation, scholars like Nikolai Bolkhovinov and Nikolai Sivachov, defended their first doctoral dissertations during this period of time. It was a period when both Soviet public and historians tried to understand America, how it was populated, and how its relation with Russia had developed. At the same time, it was the first phase of cultural discovery of America by both Soviet academics and the ordinary public through reading American books and watching American movies. First time in 58, 59, Soviet administration requested from the Soviet historians the information about US history and the history of Russian-American relations. Since then, the Soviet Americans had begun advising Soviet government on regular basis. The third geopolitical influence came from the détente of the 1970s. A new round of relaxation of international tensions, especially between the Soviet Union and the United States, contributed not only to an improvement in US-Soviet relations, an increase in scholarly and cultural exchange, but also to the growing consumption of Western cultural products, especially music and films, and as a result, to mass westernization of Soviet youth culture. Following the needs of new diplomacy, Soviet government created the new Soviet centers for American studies in Moscow and Kiev in the 70s. At the same time, a new generation of the Brezhnev era, I would call them Semidesiatniki, people of the 70s, grew up under the new influences of détente and westernization of their cultural life. This was a period of the new cultural dialogue and implementation of the achievements of American civilization in everyday Soviet realities. So its course not only brought the new scholarly methods and technologies from America, but also tried to incorporate the new knowledge of America into the narrow dogmatic framework of the orthodox Marxist theory, which eventually led to cultural and ideological confusion in both academia and society in general. The representatives of the last Soviet generation of Soviet Americans who joined the new centers of American studies later during the 80s were influenced and trained by Semidesiatnik. Although a majority of these scholars grew up during the 70s, their intellectual trajectory was shaped mainly by the events of late 1980s. That is why I call them Восьмидесятники, people of the 80s. The period of the late 80s was the beginning of the last and the most crucial geopolitical influence for American studies in the Soviet Union. During this period known as perestroika, not only the development of the entire country, but also directions and themes of the Soviet American studies had changed. With the new opening of the Soviet society to various foreign influences, the new generation, young generation, accepted these influences, especially new approaches and methodology, a peculiar form of Soviet epistemological revolution, and became the most active participants in the restructuring of thematic orthodoxy of Soviet American studies, challenging conservatism of the older generation of Semidesiatniki. Perestroika opened the process of integration of Soviet scholars into the international academic community, which led to the spread of Western methodology and the popular themes of Western historiography, such as new social and cultural history, post-structuralism, gender, and identity studies. This period witnessed a growing distancing of the provincial scholars from Moscow and an increase of tensions between Muscovites and provincial elites. National and regional identity shaped now a research agenda in Russia and non-Russian Soviet republics. The large generation of Soviet Americans, Восьмидесятники, became shaped by these new controversial developments. They tried to link the old traditions of the founders of Soviet Amerikanistika, scholars like Arbatov and Bolkhovinov, with the new demands of research and the new scholarship from the West. The representatives of this perestroika generation, together with Semidesiatniki, would become leaders in American studies in post-Soviet space, trying to recreate significant role of their field, not only in culture education, but also in shaping international and domestic policy of their states, post-Soviet states. During the Khrushchev thaw, through Brezhnev détente and Gorbachev perestroika, westernizers concept of American history became the prevailing trend in Soviet academia. But with the dissolution of Soviet Union, this process was interrupted by the humiliation of Yeltsin's so-called bandit era and Putin's authoritarianism. The new post-Soviet Russian state with its new Russian nationalist state ideology ousted American westernizers to the margins of post-Soviet academia. Now, Slavophile, or sometimes they call Pochminiki, interpretations of the American past dominate historical perception of the United States in Putin's Russia. Look at Vyacheslav Nikhonov's writing, or Andronik Migranyan, former westernizers. Moreover, the traditional Soviet legacy of confrontational discourse in American studies with a former Soviet concept of the unreliability of Western allies, including Americans, a notion which is widely spread now in both popular culture and academic studies in Putin's Russia, replaced a discourse of cultural dialogue and mutual understanding. Like in the 19th century, according to Kovalevsky's complaint, which I started my presentation, the state today, it is Putin's nationalist autocracy, again dominates the Russian interpretation of US history. Unfortunately, Russian historians today, like Vyacheslav Nikonov, for example, forgot what Bolkhovinov emphasized in 1968 during the peak of the Cold War. I quote, "We do not intend to present an idealized picture and create an impression that no disagreement or antagonism exists between Russia and America. The lesson of Russian-American relations consists not in the absence of differences and conflicts, but in the fact that history testifies to the possibility of overcoming them, not with the help of weapons, but peacefully by means of negotiations." Thank you very much.
Thank you. We turn now to Dr. Yafeng Xia, who is a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project and also Associate Professor of History at Georgetown University and at Long Island University. Your frequent guest here at the Wilson Center. It's very good to see you again. Dr. Xia is also the author of Negotiating with the Enemy, U.S.-China Talks During the Cold War, which runs from 49 to 72 in his book, and he has written articles in Diplomatic History magazine, the Journal of Cold War Studies, the Chinese Historical Review, and the International History Review. He is also a former diplomat from 1995 to 1998. He served as second secretary at the Chinese Embassy in Washington, and so he has firsthand experience with the way that national narratives can affect bilateral relations. Dr. Xia.
Okay, thank you, Rob, for the introduction. But I have to correct you. I'm not a professor at Georgetown. I'm sorry. I hope I am.
Really? Well, we have some people in the Department of History from Georgetown here today, so maybe you can correct that.
First time you use this.
Okay, thanks for the opportunity. In my 20 minutes presentation, I want first of all to make two observations. That is, first, I would say that there is no one view, one Chinese view of the United States of America. So because China is a huge country, so there are always many differences. My second observation is that Chinese view of America have changed over time in the past 100 years or so. So in my presentation, I would like to talk about Chinese view of America from early 20th century, from later Qing, throughout the Republic of China, and to the communist period up to now. So I will divide, for the purpose of the presentation and the discussion, I would divide into four distinctive periods. So it's from early 20th century to 1949, so end of the Republic period. And then from 1949 to 1979, 77, I would say. So that's China under Mao Zedong. And then then is from 1978 to 1989. So that's the period of Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening. And then is from 1989 to now. So that is the time after the Tiananmen incident. And so I would say that the Chinese view of America changed over time from admiration in the early 20th century to ambivalence during World War II or 1940s. And then under Mao from 1949 to 1970s is hostility And then under Deng, in the 1980s, is more of Chinese were more positive and diverse on America. And now, after 1989, it's a mixture of admiration and hostility or hatred. So my presentation will be in 4 parts. The first part, so now I'm going to read from my prepared statement. From 1900 to 1949, the Chinese debate about America was relatively open and diverse, focusing on how China could benefit from U.S. experience. For some Chinese, the image of America as a great nation of democracy and science assumed a new ethical and a religious meaning, the so-called special relation between America and the Chinese. Now, during this period of time, China experienced continuous war and revolution, and the chaos in the country actually allowed extensive contact with the United States. As such, competing interpretation and assessment of America flourished. Certain patterns were emerging. So I actually will divide my presentation in each period. I look at the political elites, Chinese intellectuals, and the general public, the people on the street, how they view the United States of America. So during this period of time, from 1900 to 1949, the Chinese political elites, such as the reformed Confucianist scholar Liang Qicao, the Republican and the nationalist Sun Yat-sen, and Chiang Kai-shek, and the communist leader Mao Zedong, all initially expressed their admiration for liberal ideas embodied by United States. Even the confirmed anarchist intellectual Kang You-wei stated that of all the countries on earth, none is as prosperous and contented as the United States of America, and it could. To the revolutionaries of 1911, the American model was particularly attractive. In Sun Yat-sen's famous 3 principles of the people, his notion of people's livelihood was derived from Harry George's notion of single tax. Yes, many of you might know Harry George. But eventually, they reversed their position to varying extents. Either Sun Yat-sen or Chiang Kai-shek or Mao Zedong. Eventually, they changed their view of America from admiration to ambivalence or to hostility. In most cases, they were borrowing to a political reality, the need to rally popular support in collectivist struggle for China's national survival and for effective socio-political reorganization. So now, the next paragraph, I'm going to talk about how Chinese intellectuals they view America. Now, during the same period, Chinese intellectuals engaged in relatively free debate on what lesson China might learn from America. Now, in their case, however, the idealist intellectual, people like Hu Shi, now many of you know Hu Shi, who were educated at Columbia and Cornell and earned a PhD. He stayed in United States from 1910 to 1917. Now, he was the most who favored America, and during World War II, he was China's ambassador to the United States. So he favored America. He was very positive about America. But people like Hu Shi, now these idealist intellectuals, they were losing to more realist intellectuals who moved toward political activism. So I give 2 examples here about the 2 examples of the realist intellectual. One is the very famous, renowned Chinese educator whose name called Tao Xingzi. He was educated at Columbia. He earned a master's degree at Columbia. Later on, when he turned to China, he decided he did not want to teach at a very elite school in Beijing or Shanghai. He started a royal teachers college to training Chinese to training teachers in the rural side. Now he believed that only by educating the best elementary and secondary school teacher in China's rural side. Could that be able to change China? Now, the other intellectual, who is Zhou Taofen. Now, Zhou Taofen was a leading journalist, publisher, and a political dissent. Now, in his case, he traveled to United States in 1935 for 2 months. But what he see was very negative. He turned out to be very critical of the United States. And well, he also was thrown into jail by Chiang Kai-shek for a time in 1940s. Now, by the time of his death, actually in 1944, he became a communist. He actually became communist, and he at his deathbed, he told Zhou Enlai that he wanted the party to take care of his sons. And the party actually took care of his son. He later in the 1990s, one of his sons became a vice premier. That's Zhou Jiahua. So Zhou Taofen was a leading journalist, publisher, and political dissent. He was very critical of America. He also spent some time in the United States. So the next paragraph, I'm talking about how Chinese masses, during this period of time, they view America. Now, in the case of Chinese masses, the period from 1900 to 1949 began with a violent anti-foreign and anti-modern peasant uprising, so the Boxers' Rebellion, and ended with emotional anti-America protest in the later 1940s. In this case, actually, is because American troops in Beijing, in China, one of the American soldiers raped a Beijing University student who was actually from a prominent Chinese family. And the communists actually used this, turned this to be an anti-American, anti-Chiang Kai-shek protest. Now, with relatively little knowledge of outside world, the Chinese masses, Chinese common people, intuitively reacted to issues that affected their daily life. To them, the collectivist social and political program advocated by the Chinese communists were easier to comprehend than the individualistic culture that America embodied, especially when the communists acted so skillfully as grassroots organizer and propagandists. So now I turn to my second part, second stage, that is from 1949 to 1977. So that is when China under Mao, under Mao Zedong. So Chinese Communist government carried out anti-Western and anti-American social and political propaganda, with American representing evil and decadent in official Chinese media. In the 1950s, in China saw the establishment of official control over appraisal of the United States. In the decade's early years, the Chinese government, eager to consolidate its position in the country and mobilize the masses to support the Korean War, effectively combined efforts of comprehensive social and political reorganization with stringent rectification of Chinese view of the America. Socialist reform and anti-American instruction naturally aided each other, since the advocacy of socialist life amounted to rejection of American individualism and vice versa. Now, in 1957, the Chinese intellectuals, concerned with the increasing rigidity that was stifling Chinese society, spoke out against many communist policy, including strict control over China's American issue. Now, this challenge to the authority of the Communist Party failed, and this unexpected outbreak of dissent only further hardened the government's determination to restrain what could and could not be voiced about the United States. Against this general background, throughout the 1960s and especially during the early years of Cultural Revolution, American virtually became a synonym for decadence and evil. I'm going to actually cut off the next part, which is I I have a little bit more to talk about how the Chinese leader Mao Zedong view the United States of America. Maybe I can save that for question and answers. But I can, I may just add that Mao Zedong, although the government officially were anti-America, demonizing America, but privately, even in the 1950s, Mao talked to his doctor, Dr. Li Zisui, his private physician, that he actually preferred people who were trained in the U.S. and in the West to work for him, or especially like his physician. Those people with special skills, he preferred those who are trained in America and in the West to work for him, not those who trained in Russia. So now I come to my third part of the presentation. That is from 1978 to 1989. Now, in the context of China's reform and opening to the outside world, the perception of America propounded by the Chinese government and among intellectuals and the general public become more positive and diverse. Entering the 1980s, as China went through a liberal reform and built a free market economy, the reputation of the U.S. was rehabilitated to a certain extent. The Chinese state, now with a dual goal of stability and development on its mind, struggled to maintain a balance between the need to allow openness to the U.S. and the desire to prevent American influence from going out of control. Now, this delicate task was made more difficult by the fact that the Chinese intellectuals were actively advocating the introduction of Western culture into Chinese life, and the fact that the Chinese masses wavered frequently between their longing for a better life and the fear of unpredictable changes. Now, overall, the atmosphere in the 1980s was one of eager exploration and hopefulness. Now, the last stage is the last phases of Chinese view of America is from 1989 onward. There have been a mixture of positive reception of American ideas and a way of life, along with resentment of perceived American arrogance and selfishness. The reform and open up significantly liberalized Chinese society, introducing reducing the differences in lifestyle of China and America. Now, in this sense, general conditions in China make it easier for the Chinese to comprehend the American way of life, and exoticism associated with the U.S. diminished. Now, the exoticism associated with the U.S. diminished. In the meantime, however, China's economic success have gave rise to a strong national sentiment, especially after 2008, the financial crisis in the United States. Increasingly, many Chinese grew impatient with the arrogance of hostility they saw in U.S. policy toward China. A new paradox came into play, and it remained to be seen how the contradiction will work itself out in the time to come. So to summarize, in the final analysis, Chinese people endeavor to make sense of the U.S. Constitute an integral part of nation's search for individual way of life, productive, balance, and justice. They view America in light of its relevance to their own country, and they perceive America through their own historical and cultural lenses. Thank you very much.
Well, let me thank both of you for giving us a grounding and an overview in about a century or more of American historical studies in these two great societies. But I heard one really common theme. I mean, even just the structure of your presentations, and I get it, you're historians. I did my undergraduate in history. I know how it works. Dates are important. But it was overwhelmingly focused on what were the kind of political exigencies of the moment, right? You literally define periods, in your case, Professor Shah, and to some extent also Professor Zhuk, based on what the kind of political orientation of the regime was at that time, and therefore, I get it, what it permitted its scholars, its institutes, and so forth to do. And yet, that begs a pretty important question in kind of understanding people and understanding places. It's the study of humanity. That's what we're all engaged in here at the Wilson Center, and that is what, in fact, were the historians thinking? I mean, I get it that history as a discipline was instrumentalized. I get it. But I wonder how instrumental were the individuals who approached these questions. In other words, why would you choose American studies if you were a dyed-in-the-wool, America-hating Chinese communist or Soviet communist? Did you think at all differently about the question of American foreign policy, the policy of the evil capitalist American government, and the history of the American people? After all, it's 200, 300, 400 years of people living in a particular place with culture and practices and so on. And then that gives rise to maybe the most fundamental question, which is, and Professor Zhuk, I think you addressed this and sort of dismissed it and set it aside very early. What about disciplinary aspects? What does it mean to be a historian if everything you do is simply in service of some political goal or other? In other words, was there, even within the world of instrumentalized political history of America, was there nonetheless a sort of disciplinary core that at least kind of got some of the basic facts and truths right, even if you spun them differently? And I would suggest that, as someone who watches Russian history of America today, I would suggest that actually is something very interestingly that has been going on in Russia most recently. That actually the basic professional caliber is pretty good. So the facts are there. It's just the spin that gets layered on top of it. So that's a very big, broad set of questions. If I can ask you guys to answer just really a couple minutes each so that we have plenty of time for audience questions, but I think it's a good transition.
Well, personal dimension was very important, and all my characters, actually, I finished recently a book about personal history of these people who invented America and Soviet and post-Soviet Russia and Ukraine. All these characters were influenced, paradoxically for you, by American popular culture. During the so-called Stalin's era, we had mass westernization through so-called trophy film and American jazz. People watched Stagecoach film as the first, John Wayne on Soviet screen, but he was a major character, hero for Bolkhovinov, Sivachov, and all these guys who became, and Georgy Arbatov, who became later on founding fathers. Then jazz came from Sun Valley Serenade. People began switching from German language to English language. German was predominant foreign language in Soviet schools in the 40s, but because of American jazz, all these guys began doing this English language. Then they fell in love with American native population, with American Indians. I devoted an entire part of my book to so-called Soviet Indianistica. Millions and millions of kids, including myself, followed Wounded Knee accident in United States, watched Hoyka Mitic, substitute of Western, watching, of course, American Western, like My Darling Clementine, but more Indians were in DEFA, East German and West German movies than in American Westerns. So we had an entire school of these specialists in American literature, like Vashchenko, like Tishkov. Tishkov became eventually director of Institute of Ethnography, who were influenced by this Indian, American Indians with, it was, this discovery of America through popular culture was very important. Plus, another moment of, and I'm finishing, of popular discovery of America was through visits to America. Meeting American ordinary people, meeting American politicians. It was wide-opening expertise and experience for all these Americans. For example, issues of national identity for Bolkhovitinov and Sivachov, became very important. Both Russian nationalists came to United States and discovered Solzhenitsyn. They began reading Solzhenitsyn, not only reading files of documents, but in New York Library, Bolshevik read Solzhenitsyn first circle, and English translation, of course, but still. And then they met Russian patriots from the first wave of immigration. Moreover, then these Americans met Ukrainian Americans like Basil Dmitryshin from Portland State University, who was supposed to be, Bender White. And suddenly this conversation with this Ukrainian nationalist who taught Russian history here at Portland State University opened horizons to Bolshevikinov. He began developing this respect not only for Russian patriotic feelings, but also for Ukrainian patriotic feelings, which were suppressed. So it was very important personal dimension. I just had no time for this. So you're right. Personal dimension was very important, including myself. Can you imagine that Creedence Clearwater Revival and Doors and Simon Garfunkel, Santana were the first teachers of my English, because I had very bad English teacher in my school. But listening to Fogarty accent, I still admire this. I began then, after listening to CCR, reading США Политика Идеология journal, because I want to know what happened in this America. So through Voice of America and Deutsche Welle music sessions, I began actually studying American history as well. So I finished.
Professor Shah?
Okay. I think that before 1949, before the communists took over, the Chinese view of America was more open and diverse. So there are rooms for people to debate about America. And also, after the 1977, starting the reform and opening, in the 1980s, it's open, diverse, but government, the Chinese Communist government still want to control, especially the introduction of American culture, American movies. Now in China, I think that scholars, general public, they still debate whether they still debate about America. So there are still different views about that. Now, here I would say that especially during the time of Mao, from 1949 to 1977, during that period of time, is definitely is government control. The communist government controlled what you can say about America. So during that time, it's the American study was basically a forbidden zone, forbidden territory. Now, true, the government give the scholars who associate with Chinese government. They study the history of American people. We do have that kind of subject, and also they study the dark side of the United States, racism, social, civil rights movement, violence in the cities. Now, as far as the diplomatic history, did they get the facts right? No, I don't think so. For example, the typical case of the Korean War. We all know now that is North Korea started the attack. But I think before I come to America in 1995, I read everything from Chinese sources is that it's South Korea attacked first. So I would say that. Yeah, I stop.
So
here.
weak disciplinary
Very weak
methodology.
discipline.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, the floor is open. Why don't we take, we can just, I think, take one question at a time to start with. There should be microphones on both sides of the room. If you just introduce yourself and your affiliation, and we'll go from there. Yes, right here, sir.
Pei Xu from Voice of America. And before the Chinese Communist Party took over in 1949, Chairman Mao expressed his admiration for the United States political system, admire the government of the people, by the people, for the people, so on and so forth. And nowadays, the Chinese Communist Party headed by Xi Jinping, who admired Mao very much. Well, under Xi, constitutionalism in China is a taboo now. So what has happened between in the intervening years? Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay.
Questions for you?
Well, you are right, actually. Mao, for a certain period of time, for example, in 1936, in his interview with the American journalist Edgar Snow, Mao actually, he hoped to establish an anti-fascist international front with the United States. And also in August 1944, in his conversation with the John Service, a member of the U.S. Dixie Mission, U.S. Army Observers Group in Yan'an, Mao also said that after the war, economic reconstruction would be China's most urgent task, stating that China and the United States are mutually beneficiary, and we must keep in touch with the United States. But Mao was a politician. I would say that Mao, during the war, during World War II, he wanted basically to get support from the United States. He hoped that the United States would support him, not Chiang Kai-shek, or maybe support Chiang Kai-shek and also his group. But we know that because the United States supported Chiang Kai-shek and the communists eventually defeated Chiang Kai-shek, and Mao formed a military alliance with the Soviet Union. So for Mao, I don't think that Mao had any idea of constitution. He didn't really know a constitution. He didn't care about the constitution. I would say Mao is the last emperor of China. He's really the last emperor. He ruled like emperor. Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping had visited America for many times. I think since he became the top leader, he has been visiting America for 7 times. And he also studied, before that, he studied in U.S. for some time.
A fairly short period of time.
Yes. I think Xi Jinping is positive about U.S.-China relation. For example, he said that the Pacific Ocean is so vast, it could have China and the United States. And he also stated that in dealing with the United States, he hoped that the U.S. and China could establish a new type of great power relation, no conflict, no confrontation, mutual benefits, and a win-win cooperation. I think he's positive, but domestically he has many problems to deal with, and he wants to establish his control, or to get the house clean first, and then maybe in his second term, we hope that he will be more liberal or more open. That's my view.
Okay, great. We have a lot of hands up, so let's keep them up. Gentleman in the way back there? No, all the way in the back. Yep. Thank you. Just keep your hands up. I will definitely get to everyone. I mean, when we go to the next round, you don't have to keep
Good morning.
I'm a little jet lagged, sorry.
Good morning. Thank you for your very interesting narratives. Brigadier General Retired Peter Zwack, NDU, INS. My question goes back to the period that you both discussed with the Soviet Union and People's Republic of China that had a particularly bad view, resentful view of the United States. My question very simply is the border clashes along the Ussuri River in 1969, which sort of culminated, if you will, this looming Sino-Soviet split. How did that affect in China and in the Soviet Union both the official and the internal narrative toward the United States within those countries, to both professors?
Great.
Yeah, it was a very important issue for Soviet academia. Immediately after these clashes, MGU, Moscow State University, had special sessions, and the Institute of World History had special discussion about this, and they criticized revisionism of Mao and emphasized necessity to study working class movement in United States and American diplomacy as well. As a result, we have new applications for American Council and Societies, fellowships from Soviet Academy of Sciences to study criticism of Maoism as revisionism in United States. We got Sivachov coming to Columbia University to study this. So we have new books about the New Deal and working class in America, praising American working class movement and criticizing revisionism of Chinese communism.
Okay. The Sino-Soviet border clash in March 1969, I think had tremendous influence on Mao's decision for the rapprochement with the United States. But even Mao had to move very carefully. Now, this event, of course, has a major. It's a major threat. It's a security threat for the Chinese leadership and also the Chinese people. So now the Soviet Union truly become #1 enemy of China. So China need allies. So China need an international united front. So that's the reason that Mao. I would say that this was one of the major reasons that Mao decided to improve China's relation with the United States. And I'd say that even Mao had to be very careful because United States had been demonized in communist China for 20 years. So he had to move this very carefully. So he first had to prepare the nation and the people for this turnabout in international relation, international alliance system. So we know the April 1970, the ping pong diplomacy, which actually prepared the nation and the people for the forthcoming shake hands with Kissinger and Nixon. But Mao was, I would say that Mao was a strategist on the other hand. Now, even if we decided to change relation, to improve relation with the United States, now he was not full-hearted. Now he was still, his revolutionary sentiment was still high. Now, so he was vaccinating between revolution and détente with the United States.
Great. Wayne, right here.
Wayne Mary, the American Foreign Policy Council. A question for each. For Professor Jia, my parents' generation of Americans, the generation of the 30s and 40s, had a view of China that was overwhelmingly filtered through the work of the American missionaries and something of what I'd call a pearl buck, idealized view of China. I'd be interested in your comments on the impact of particularly the missionaries on the Chinese view of America, for good or ill. What influence did that relationship have on how Chinese viewed this country? And for Professor Zhu, when I lived in Moscow in the early 80s, it seemed like everybody I met had an image of America that was filtered through the novels of Theodore Dreiser. And this drove me nuts, partly because I thought of Dreiser's view as being stuck in amber in the early 1920s somewhere. And yet I discovered that there was a phenomenal number of academic papers, dissertations written about Dreiser in the Soviet Union. I mean, 50, 100 times more than they were in the United States. And I'm wondering sort of why that particular writer, among all American writers, if you agree with that, and what other American writers, in your experience, in your research, were filters for Russians finding an image of America that they found right?
Okay. Who wants to go?
Well, my generation, so I grew up in communist China. So my generation, who grew up under Mao, we didn't really know anything about American missionary activity in China until very late when in the 1990s, when I come to U.S., I got to know more about that part of the story. So Chinese admiration of America is basically American science, American technology, American power. American is the richest country that we Chinese have to emulate, to develop, to learn from. So I don't think that missionaries had any strong impact on people grew up in communist China.
Yeah, it's a great question. Actually related to my projects of Rock and Roll Rocket City, because I have a chapter about fascination of Soviet readers with American literature. Before Theodore Dreiser, we had two kings of American literature who influenced all Russian, Soviet, and Ukrainian imagination of America. James Fenimore Cooper. For you, it sounds probably obsolete, but you will be surprised how many Russian Ukrainians still read James Fenimore Cooper. Everything from his Nathaniel Bumppo stories to his pirates novels, spy. It's encyclopedia of American life. Although many of our readers forgot that this guy wrote some of these stories in Paris. But anyway, it's a different story. The second figure is, of course, Mark Twain. Mark Twain, every school in Soviet times had special list of recommended readings. And if you analyze this, it could be found on internet and Google in my book, if you want. You will see that three figures where it was James Fenimore Cooper, Edgar Allan Poe, and Edgar Allan Poe became a cult figure. So if you intellectual enough, you're supposed to memorize Raven by heart. Ask Vlad Zubak. Vlad Zubak still remembers that he did this in both English and Russian. And I had, well, are you crazy? Because I wrote this in English. I hated Russian translation, but anyway. So James Fenimore Cooper, Edgar Allan Poe, and Mark Twain. Then came to the Dreiser. Why Dreiser? Because Dreiser visited Soviet Union. And officially it was, pro-communist. Like Sinclair, all these guys, Mark Rackers, and fascination with Dreiser. I hated Dreiser, but believe me, many of the Russians still liked him. And in the 80s, we had two films based on Dreiser's stories. But most important for underground and for critical approach to Soviet mainstream was, of course, Hemingway. Hemingway was cult figure during the Khrushchev thaw, because who made revolution in our reading habits was Khrushchev. Иностранная литература began publishing, иностранная литература, it's periodical resumed in Soviet Union in the 50s. They began publishing Faulkner, they began publishing Hemingway. Hemingway became cult for young generation of the 60s, of these шестидесятники. If you look for Aksionov pictures of these, figures of Soviet youth culture, Vysotsky, Aksionov, all of them had this dresses like Hemingway or smoking. Smoking, drinking became fashionable again because for intellectuals, and cursing. Zinoviev, Зияющая высота, was cursing with this ебанцы, and sorry for this language. All this generation which criticized Soviet reality from Vysotsky to Zinoviev was inspired by Hemingway. But in the 80s, it was different culture. It was more commercial culture of rock and roll, disco. But believe me, Hemingway, I still think that Hemingway was more important for this generation than.
Could I, Matt, just a quick addendum to that? It's an interesting list. Fenimore Cooper and Dreiser had really no purchase in Chinese reading of American literature when that exploded in the 80s. Poe and Twain did to a degree, but Hemingway also was probably, especially The Old Man and the Sea, was huge. But I was interested in the rest of your list. John Wayne, Creedence Clearwater Revival, The Doors, jazz. Those were not part of the way.
Grand Funk Railroad.
Grand Funk Railroad.
Number one band of the set. For you, again, this kind of but Grand Funk Railroad, everyone in my class, even female pods, loved Grand Funk.
None of those had any purchase in China went for a much more melodic, tuneful. John Denver, the Carpenters,
We hate-
Rodgers and Hammerstein. Karaoke, it was a much more tuneful, pretty melodic, not so much the classic rock, and certainly not John Wayne in China. In China, it was Marilyn Monroe, Charlie Chaplin, sort of a lighter fare, and there seems to be almost sort of a macho strain.
John Wayne
Russian-
in 70s was forbidden, but it was favorite Stalin's hero, John Wayne, and Ringo from Stagecoach. You remember this
That's a
character?
different list in China.
Okay. All right. Let's. We have about 15 minutes left, so why don't we take a couple of questions at once here, so we make sure that we get them. Okay. Yeah. Well, go ahead. Right here.
Hi, my name is Zhu Xiaodi from the Emerson Foundation. As I listened to both of your presentations, I was struck by the paradigm change. It looks like every 10 years or 20 years or 30 years at most, will be or should be a paradigm change. This reminds me of a weather joke. It's like, if you don't like the weather, wait for 10 minutes, it will change. So by your calendar, 1989 as the last changing point in China. And by 2019, should we or are we expecting to see another paradigm change? If not, by 2029, and then what? What kind of change towards what direction or nature?
And right here, sir, you had a question?
Hi, Mike Henning from USAID. Thanks for the presentation. Comment and question. Comment is thanks for the endorsement of sort of exchange programs and other things that the U.S. tries to promote when possible, even in tough situations.
We should
And
just
also-
send Grand Funk Railroad.
That's right. And I was going to say there's international media and global culture also has its role, which maybe that's more private sector, but it is an encouragement that even in big giant countries that this kind of person-to-person or cultural exchange can have an impact. My question is leading into an article that I've just scanned over that Robert and Matt wrote, which is what kind of posture we should take towards these countries, and that's sort of the flip side of this, the U.S. towards these countries, and how it's perceived in the countries related to human rights discussion, democracy issues, and other things. There's two strands of thought, and every country in the world sort of will tell us, the United States, please don't criticize us publicly, it's so embarrassing, and of course when we will tell our people that you're the evil Americans, and here they go insulting our pride. And every country says the same thing about any external criticism, especially coming from this global hegemon, the United States. Maybe in China and Russia it would be better to have a softer approach in order to sort of not poke the bear or the great powers of the world. But I wonder if in country it's perceived as weakness on the side of the United States when we maybe adjust our language to suit local context. I always think about Sharansky and others saying, when Reagan said "evil empire," we heard that and we liked that, and that was good. But maybe it was not effective. So from a historical perspective, if you have an opinion, it'd be interesting to hear. Thanks.
Small question. Okay. All right. Professor Shah, do you want to take the first question?
Okay. Thank you for the question. I'm not a fortune teller, but I try. I think that the Chinese view America in its relevance to its own country, to their own country. So in that sense, I would say that if China become more open, it might be more positive about America, that their view of America may be more positive. But currently, the Chinese government in Beijing seems to be very cautious in dealing with the United States. Chinese public, many Chinese people on the street, you might say, the ordinary people. On the one hand, they admire America, but on the other hand, they also resent about American meddling in world affairs. So I think for the United States, maybe a softer approach toward China is a better option. So I don't know the paradigm change. I hope it will become more positive.
In Russia, in the Soviet Union, overall, from 70s to perestroika, overall general public attitude toward America was very positive. Probably too much. It was assassination of America. Everything changed, of course, now. Now, majority of Russians, and unfortunately now, and Ukrainians as well, share a very anti-American view, perceiving America as very weak, undecisive power, which lost to Putin, especially in my case, in the case of Ukraine, because Putin's winning, even punishing us, Ukraine, for our independent stance. About what you need to do, you need to invite young people before 30 years old from provincial universities, not from Moscow, not from St. Petersburg. Look, my best friend Ivan Kurila came from Volgograd, not from Moscow. Well, he moved to Leningrad, to St. Petersburg, excuse me. So young people before 30s from provincial cities, these guys, it's your target. Not these old farts, all these guys from Moscow and...
We say flatus at the Wilson Center.
I just... And, well, I belong to this generation of old... still, what now mentality of Russians required more decisive and more probably anti-Putin position of American administration. Believe me, it will change, especially with the economic situation in Russia right now, because otherwise, general public in post-Soviet space would perceive America as weak, undecisive power.
Same general public, that's 86% in support of Putin right now. Okay. Sir in the back there, and we'll take a couple of questions, even if it's 75%.
No, it's 80s, people told me.
Yes, my name is Keith Hill. I'm with Bloomberg BNA, and this is for Professor Shah. You mentioned American meddling in world affairs and American arrogance as a reason for resentment by some Chinese. What about anti-foreigner sentiment that existed in the early 20th century, as well as acts by America, such as passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 19th century? Do those also contribute to resentment of America by some Chinese?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
And up here in the front, I think I saw two hands. Yeah, go ahead, sir, and then we'll get you. The gentleman in front with the coat and tie. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Mitsuo Nakai, member of Reagan Foundations in California. I have two questions. Number one,
Did the Russians like Reagan's cowboy movies?
What's Chinese view of North Korea or the unification of the Korean Peninsula? That's my main question. That's about it.
Okay.
Okay. And why don't we take the third question here, too? Yeah.
Question for Dr. Zhuk, please. To what extent were Stalin and Molotov educated and informed about the United States, its history, its culture, its government, its politics, and its economy, and so on? And where did they get their education, and was it objective and accurate?
Excellent. Yeah. All right. Who wants to go first? Yeah.
Well, thank you for the question about the Chinese exclusion and the Boxer Rebellion. I think these are the historical offenses which the Chinese they always remember that that the American did these things wrong to China, but there are more recent offenses. For example, many of you probably know that the Chinese the U.S. come out of strongly oppose Beijing's bid to hold 2000 Olympic Games, now which many Chinese knows. That's 1993. The Yinghe incident, 1993. That the U.S. government charged a Chinese cargo ship the Inho, then on the high sea en route to Iran, was carrying contraband materials that could be used to produce biochemical weapons, which actually when the American forcefully tried to check on the ship, it found nothing. So this also turned, China's effort to obtain membership in the World Trade Organization in 1994 in face of strong American resistance, U.S. bombing of the Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia. These are the recent offenses which the Chinese, especially people now in China, they know, and the government skillfully actually use this to turn against America. Americans' arrogance, Americans' meddling in Chinese and international affairs. For the North Korea question, actually I know a lot, but because it is not very relevant to this session, so I just answer the question very briefly. I think the Chinese attitude toward the North Korean unification is still wavering because on the one hand, China seems still don't want the North Korea regime to fall because of the refugee issues. Also because the China was not sure whether South Korea and the United States would actually move its troops north of 30th parallel. That will pose as a threat. So I think China is still not sure what its position is regarding North Korea, regarding Korean Peninsula. So China actually had a very close relation with South Korea now. China's relation with North Korea has been very cold in the last 3 years.
Information came through reading, of course, first, because Stalin famously was, a great reader. But another source of information came directly from people from the United States of America, American communists like Lev Israelovich Zubak, who in 1825 came from Philadelphia. Vlad is his grandson. I have a chapter about Lev Zubak. Lev Zubak was an American communist with Ukrainian Jewish roots. He worked for Comintern, Profintern in Philadelphia. Then he was a graduate student at Penn, by the way. But he went to Soviet Union to help Soviet Union to build this new, wonderful society built on principles of social justice and social equality. But then Stalin didn't allow him to come back and resume his studies at Penn. Zubak and other American and British communists provided Stalin through special committee in Comintern and Profintern with very important information about domestic policy and international policy of United States. Many Soviet Americanists became related to the family of Stalin because Alliluyeva, for example, was a student of Zubak, and Molotov's son was a student of Zubak, and founding mother of Soviet American Indian studies became related to famous Soviet specialist in China, by the way, and she was protected by Molotov. So we have very interesting combination of personal relations through Alliluyeva, through Molotovs, to these guys, beginning with Lev Zubak. So we had very good, information for Stalin. But starting with campaign of 1947-48, we need to be careful with Stalin's perception of reality. But before this, he had first-hand direct information from two sources: American communists and people who were called later on American Zionists, Jewish activists who tried to help Soviet Union.
Okay, I think we got all the questions. We're nearly at the witching hour here, so Thank you both. Robert, do you want to close on it?
Thank you for coming. We wish you all happy holidays, and keep an eye in your e-inboxes for further discussions in this series. Thank you.
Thank you.